Welcome to section 9.1. This is our final chapter, and we're going to start by talking about quadratic equations. In fact, that's the topic of the entire chapter that we're going to focus on. So let's just go ahead and start with a few review. First off, how would you solve this quadratic equation? Go ahead, pause the video and solve it. Well, now that you've solved it, the only way that we know how to solve this to this point in time is by factoring it. That's back from chapter 6. So we can factor this, and it factors into x minus 5 and x plus 3. You can check that factoring if you broke it apart and so forth. I'm just skipping those intermediate steps. That's how it factors. So once it factors, remember you could use the zero product rule, set each one equal to 0, and solve them, and we end up with x is 5 or x is negative 3. So again, the only way we had was factoring. What about x squared minus 81 equals 0? How would you solve that? Go ahead and pause the video and solve it. Well, again, we can factor it. It's a difference of squares. So we have x minus 9, x plus 9, set them each equal to 0. And again, we end up with positive 9, negative 9. So that's nice. But what about this one? How would you solve this? Well, there's a slight problem. You can't factor it because that's not a difference of squares. So in fact, it's a prime polynomial in terms of in the form of everything we've dealt with. So we need a whole new method to go about these problems. And we're going to get to two methods in this section. Our first method is something called the square root property. Now, the square root property is that if I have some x squared equals a, that means that x is equal to, well, to understand this, here's a hint. It's called the square root property because the opposite of squaring a number is to take the square root. It's not just the square root of a, it's plus or minus the square root of a. Now, the reason for that is because of the absolute value that we emphasize so much. The square root of x squared was the absolute value. That absolute value leads us to have the positive or minus a. And to help this emphasize, let's just jump into some examples that we could do factoring wise, but we're going to use the square root property on them. So for instance, I have this one. I have x squared equals 25. Well, I can square root both sides. Again, just like we could square both sides to get rid of square roots, square root both sides to get rid of squares. And the square root of x squared would give me the absolute value normally, but that's why we throw the plus or minus. And the square root of 25 is 5. So it's x is plus or minus 5. And piece of advice, put that plus or minus in as soon as you start doing the square roots. Do not wait to the very end. It will cause problems, and I'll show you in a little bit. So try that. Try this one. I won't use the square root property. Go ahead and solve this. All right, so hopefully you did that, and you took the square root of both sides. As you took the square root of both sides, you realized, oh, well, that gives me x equals plus or minus, and I can factor 40. And look, I have a pair of 2's, so a 2 comes outside, and left over inside is 2 times 5, or 10. So we have x equals plus or minus 2 square root of 10. So in this case, this idea is still going to include us having to simplify radicals, specifically square roots, but it gives us a new edge. Well, what about this? X squared minus 18 equals 0. How could you use the square root property to solve this? Well, hopefully you're saying, I can't really use it right now, but if I move the 18 to the other side by adding 18 to both sides, now the x squared is isolated, and I just have a number on the other side. That allows me to use the square root property. So we can square root both sides. Go ahead and pause the video and go from here. So x is plus or minus the square root of 2 times 3 times 3, and that gives me plus or minus, well, I get a 3 on the outside and a square root of 2 on the inside. So again, we're simplifying radicals, but don't forget the plus or minus. That's absolutely critical for these problems. Okay, so this one, we again can use the square root property, but how would you use the square root property? Well, before we can apply it, remember we have to have x squared all by itself. So can you get x squared all by itself? Yeah. So take a moment, get x squared all by itself. Well, we can add 7 to both sides, divide by 2. All right, now we can use the square root property. If you didn't do that, go ahead and pause the video and do it. Otherwise, take the square root of both sides. That gives me x is plus or minus the square root of 2 times 2 times 11. That's 44 as I factored it for you. So that's plus or minus 2 square root of 11. So that is how we solve this problem, is by isolating the x squared and taking it. So let's take it up a level. Now, now I got a whole thing. But notice I still have what's being squared is still isolated on one side. That's what we like. So I can actually square root both sides. And that will give me 3x minus 4 because the square root and x squared and a quantity squared cancel out. And it gives me plus or minus the square root of 7. Well, that I can't simplify. 7 is a perfect square. Oh, sorry, not perfect square, it's a prime number. So, but I can add 4 to both sides. So I get 4 plus or minus the square root of 7. To get x all by itself, I still got to divide by 3. So we get x equals 4 plus or minus 7, all that over 3. Or in other words, I could say it's 4 minus the square root of 7 over 3 and 4 plus the square root of 7. This is just me trying to show you what the plus or minus really means. It really means there's two answers, one where it's a plus and one where it's a minus, hence the name. All right, with that in hand, I want you to try this one. Can you solve this using the Can you solve this using square root property? Okay, hopefully you did that. So we can square root both sides. And I get 3x plus 2 equals plus or minus 5, because we've already talked about the square root of 25, and don't forget the plus or minus. And that's actually really important at this stage. Well, I can subtract, I can really, to help out, now, because it's just a number, it means I'm actually going to be able to do some arithmetic here. So I'm going to set it up as it's equal to the positive 5 and negative 5, and now solve these two individual situations. If you didn't do that, go ahead and pause the video and finish solving it. Otherwise, let it go. All right, so let's deal with them. This one, obviously I subtracted 2. Again, subtract 2. I can divide by 3, divide by 3. And so my answers are x equals 1 and x equals negative 7/3. So this process, if this here right here is a radical, just go ahead and leave it all the plus or minus together. But if this is a number, I recommend breaking it up on the two separate situations and trying to work through it. All right, that's the end of the first part of the video. Continue with the second part of the video for the second strategy for solving quadratic equations, namely completing the square.